What PG&E did was violent. Whether you beat someone to death or you cause them to die in a fire, you've caused a violent death.
The violence of the campfire turned Main Street businesses to ashes. It destroyed the homes of 14,000 families and killed at least 84 innocent people.
The employees of PG&E knew. They ignored it. As a consequence, people died.
PG&E's maintenance of its power line wasn't just bad, it was criminal. The company pleaded guilty to 84 felony counts of manslaughter. Nearly every building in Paradise burned down in the span of a few hours. But PG&E's criminal behavior took place over years.
They had lit the match on this bomb years ago, and it wasn't, if it's going to go, it's when it's going to go.
What went was this nearly 100-year-old worn-down hook, which cracked, dropping the power line it was holding and sparking the fire.
PG&E's decision was simply just to let these things hang until they broke.
What did PG&E know, and when did PG&E know it? Much of the evidence used to indict PG&E has remained a secret, shown only to the grand jury. Until now. We obtained this internal PG&E report that found the same kind of wear on other old PG&E power lines. It shows PG&E knew it had this problem with old parts, and that PG&E wasn't keeping track of how old those parts were.
Your colleague had to guess how old this stuff was.
Yeah, we find that a lot.
These photos, taken by PG&E, show the company taking part in its own criminal investigation.
Literally, we're letting the murderer into the crime scene and telling them to collect our evidence for us.
Prosecutors couldn't find a qualified contractor willing to pull parts off the power line that sparked the campfire, so PG&E's own crews did the work, and the company cataloged every piece of evidence it helped collect. This hook, found a couple miles up the line from where the campfire started, shows just how bad things got. A groove more than halfway through the metal from decades of grinding against the hole it hung from. Those holes in what are called hanger plates or wear plates also became evidence.
On this side, this hole is worn, what we call keyholing.
These holes started as perfect circles, but over time got worn down by the hook. We found evidence that before the campfire, PG&E knew old parts like these were wearing past their useful lives. These worn plates showed up in a PG&E lab report, half a year before the campfire started. The photos show the hooks had worn more than halfway through the metal of the plates PG&E crews found hanging here, on this high-tension line near the Caldecott Tunnel in the Bay Area. These plates hadn't been changed in 72 years. At least, that's the best guess the engineers at PG&E's lab could make, that these plates were probably installed in 1946.
What would it have been like trying to figure out how old those plates were when they walked into the lab?
Oh, you wouldn't know.
Engineer Nick Bantz did not write this report. He was one of a handful of metallurgists working in the PG&E lab that created it, and he said PG&E had no good database for these parts.
Hooks, plates, things like that. I don't think there's records of any of those anywhere that I'm ever aware of.
PG&E's lab report shows company scientists had to guess how old parts were, using the year the tower was built, 1946.
They know the age of the towers, but they weren't tracking the age of the parts.
Exactly.
The campfire prosecutors found the same thing on the power line that burned down Paradise. PG&E had no records to show how old the parts were.
This line was energized in 1921, and then they have nothing until 1990.
Prosecutors say PG&E had a simple reason not to track the age of parts. The company wasn't interested in fixing them.
The term that all of the PG&E people run away from is run to failure.
Run to failure means not fixing a machine until it stops working. And PG&E's machine carries hundreds of thousands of volts through the air.
Running to failure, it's like running around with a loaded gun.
Former State Utilities Commissioner Catherine Sandoval says the fact that PG&E let parts get this worn down should worry all of us.
And the world that PG&E created reflects their criminal thinking and is criminally reckless.
PG&E denied that it used a run-to-failure strategy in writing to a federal judge. But prosecutors aren't alone saying the company used a run-to-failure policy. So does a former PG&E engineer.
That was talked about as company policy. I didn't even know if that wasn't publicly, but I mean, run to failure was the policy.
Did they call it that?
That's what it was joked about. Pretty much run to failure, and it wasn't that big of a deal before really the wildfire time.
Wildfire danger has, in fact, gotten worse in the last decade. PG&E frequently points to climate change as the main problem. The federal judge handling PG&E's probation is all out of patience with that. Please don't blame climate change, Judge William Alsop scolded PG&E's lawyers. Climate change doesn't start the wildfire. PG&E starts the wildfire. This report on worn parts is also evidence of how PG&E looks at this problem.
There is no remaining life to that.
In his opinion as a metallurgist, Nick Bantz told us PG&E was already on borrowed time with these hanger plates, and yet the report claimed those plates could last another 28 years.
I think it's trash, in my opinion, to even have stated it.
The lab report says it ignored the possibility these plates could crack, assuming that they'd just keep wearing evenly all the way through. But Nick says they were already at risk of cracking.
This could have fell anytime in the last decade.
That's what happened to the hooks holding up the power line that sparked the campfire.
On this one, the actual hook that caused Paradise to burn down, you can see just that tiniest bit of a nub.
We wanted to know why PG&E's lab report tried to estimate remaining life for used-up parts. Engineer Peter Martin authored that report. He now works at the Rochester Institute of Technology in New York. Martin didn't respond to our calls and emails. We do know he's trying to keep his name off of the record of PG&E's crimes, and so is this whole list of PG&E employees in a lawsuit paid for by PG&E asking a court to black their names out of the grand jury transcript. We obtained all 22 names on that list, and it includes all 4 people listed on the PG&E lab report. They're keeping quiet, but Nick has an idea of why his lab tried to say these parts did have some remaining life.
To give somebody a number for something because they were wanting a number.
A number Nick says PG&E's power line managers kept asking for. Without those managers, PG&E's lab couldn't earn billable hours of work. So he says the lab gave those managers what they asked for.
That had to do with pressure on the scientists to deliver what they were looking for?
Correct.
It's completely backwards.
Sandoval says the fact that PG&E set up a lab that had to sell its own services to managers within PG&E is more evidence of the company relying on criminal thinking.
That is not the responsibility of some guy to convince another boss to send them work. It is PG&E's responsibility as the corporation that owns those assets, maintains those assets.
Prosecutors say PG&E missed these problems because it cut back on maintenance and inspections. The company even admitted that it tied bonuses to how well supervisors cut inspection costs. PG&E told the judge it doesn't do that anymore.
And the more I study about what happened, the more galling it is. They knew that these hooks were failing.
To this day, Phil Binstock still wonders how painful his father's death was. His first check for his dad's death finally arrived, $25,000, minus attorney's fees. He told us he'd much rather see PG&E's upper management in prison.
If I had a sense that they were even trying to fix anything in a really meaningful way, maybe I wouldn't feel so harshly towards them, but evil little people.